Howdy. Today's video we are going to be going over a spore build on Saryn. I already just did a spore build on Saryn like 2 weeks ago, but I redid it and now we're gonna go over it again because it's mostly the same but improved, and I wanted to, show it even better than how it already was. And just in general, I feel like I'll be able to explain it in a more narrowed down version this time. So let's get right into it. The point of this build is to kill stuff via spores, not for a weapons platform build as most people build Saryn nowadays. We want to kill stuff with our spores, kind of like OG Saryn, right? We want to be spreading it everywhere and watching everything die a horrible, painful death because it's fun. Now, right off the bat, we have gotten rid of her 2 mold for Sickening Pulse, because Sickening Pulse is extremely nice in this build, and we will get to exactly why that is in just a second. Because first, for you to understand why this build works, you need to understand how her abilities work. Now, Saryn's first ability, Spores, is the main thing we're building around here, and it's inflicting an enemy with spores, so casting the ability on an enemy will put spores on that enemy. When you deal damage to the spores specifically, because they are on specific spots on the enemy's body, it will rupture the spores, and then it will spread spores to nearby enemies and also create a new one on the initial target that you ruptured it on. Every enemy can have up to 3 spores at a time, so that's, triple the damage over 1 spore, assuming you have 3 spores on them. You can also guarantee to rupture spores on an enemy without having to hit the specific spots if Toxic Lash is active. While Toxic Lash is active, every single hit, be it a melee or a gun, will always burst spores on the enemy. And Toxic Lash in itself is already really nice, but we're not really focusing on this today. The spores damage will build up over time. You have a special meter, a circle on the bottom right of your screen, and as the spores continue to merely exist, this is going to build up. So you do not ever want the enemies to not have spores, because the moment they stop having spores, it's going to not only stop building up, but it will start decaying, and it decays at a percentage base. So it's not going to be like, a tiny bit. The higher your spores are, the bigger amount you'll lose per second when it starts decaying, and that's very important. These spores have a chance to apply corrosive, and that status chance does scale with strength. They also snapshot your strength buff. So if you have 300% strength when you cast the spores first, it will go as if it has 300% strength the entire time they are active. And this will not reset the snapshotted buffs until your entire spore value decays entirely. So if it starts decaying and then you put the first ability on enemy again to cast spores, you'll still have that snapshotted buff from the first time. You have to let it fully decay to lose the snapshotted values. Very important, because we want strength to be as high as possible when we first cast it to snapshot, so we can do as big of damage as possible to kill enemies. Other than that, the fourth ability is the other main thing we want to use, Miasma. Miasma will apply a guaranteed viral proc to all enemies hit. It will briefly stun them, as you can see, and will make them take 400% damage from the spores for a brief period of time, so that they, get absolutely melted. That combined with the viral proc is pretty huge. But it's only one viral proc, and how we're going to be using our spores, it's going to be spreading very, very far and through walls, so we can't consistently apply viral with a companion like we normally would in other builds. It's just not going to be consistent or big enough range most of the time. Which is why we have Sickening Pulse here, because one viral proc is not max viral procs, and we want big damage. Sickening Pulse, despite how it may seem, because it does shoot out a wave, in my testing, it works through walls. I'm not sure if it's because the wave goes around the walls. I don't know how the weird geometry works. I have tested it in several different simulacrums and in mission, and no matter what I do, it always hits all of the enemies through walls. So I do believe it goes through walls. Now that I think about it, I probably should have read the wiki. I think I did, but I forgot what it said. But because of that, we can cast Miasma, and then Sickening Pulse, and it will max out all of the viral procs on the enemies. Because if you don't know what Sickening Pulse is, it is a helmet exclusive ability, so you unlock it by ranking up your helmet. It emits a pulse that will put all status effects on the enemies up to the maximum stack of 10, except for Slash, Heat, and Toxin, which it will combine and double the status procs. Although I said all max 10, but actually electricity procs don't have a max of 10, but it adds 10 status procs basically if it's anything that isn't Slash, Heat, or Toxin. So that means we can immediately get maximum viral procs. It also resets the duration of the status effects, so that's nice to make sure viral stays active. It's also cheaper to cast than Miasma, so it's cheaper to spam or do Miasma and then spam Sickening Pulse to keep viral active than it is to just spam the crap out of Miasma. It just works very, very nicely here, and it also is it has the same energy counts, or what is it, energy requirements cast as Molt does, so it's still a very good ability for shield getting purposes. Very, very nice. Something else Miasma does, which is very important, is it makes the enemy count as if they were the original enemy with spores. So other than spreading spores, how I had said earlier, which would be shooting the spores or hitting an enemy in general with Toxic Lash active, you can also outright kill the enemy and it will spread the spores. If you kill the enemy with your weapons, it will spread the spores, okay? If you kill the enemy with the spores, it will not spread spores, okay? So if this guy dies to spores, he will spread it though, and that's because he's the first enemy to be hit with them. The enemy that is hit with the first ability, right, the patient zero, the originator of all of the spores, will spread them on death regardless of what kills them. But all of the enemies that get spores after that, so if this guy dies and spreads them around, and they die to the spores and not a weapon by the player, they will not spread the spores. However, when you cast Miasma, it turns all the enemies, or at least during the duration of the ability, it makes all of them to be considered as if they were the original progenitor of the spores. So they will still spread spores when they die to them. And that is very, very important. So Miasma is literally required for this to build actually function properly. So definitely don't get rid of it. That would be rough. And Toxic Lash is just very nice here to help spread spores more and get more gun damage in general, which is why we kept that. Though if you wanted, you can put Sickening Pulse over Toxic Lash and get rid of Molt instead. That is completely up to you. But Toxic Lash will add more synergy with our weapons in this build. Now that you have a general idea of how Saryn works and how her spores work, we can go over the build for her. Now, we have 5 Archon Shards, 1 Tau Forged for casting speed. I did try this without casting speed. I tried this with 2 casting speed shards. I tried it with 1. I found that 1 is enough most of the time, especially because we will be running Mad Eye oftentimes. Let's actually switch the proper loadout. But 1, in case we aren't actively keeping Mad Eye's buff for casting speed up, it is nice to at least have this 100% of the time. We have 2 green shards, Tau Forged, for corrosive max stacks. Because corrosive, the first stack of corrosive strips enemy armor by, I think it's either 28 or 36%, can't remember off the top of my head, too lazy to do math. And all the subsequent stacks strips an extra 8% of the enemy's armor, and the cap is 10 stacks. That is an 80% armor strip. But if you increase the maximum stacks of corrosive, you can get a full armor strip, which is why we have this here. 2 normal green shards will be able to give you up to 14 stacks, which is enough for a full armor strip, because you can then strip 104% of their armor, 14 stacks. The reason we have Tau Forged instead is because there are enemies in the game that cannot normally get up to 10 stacks, such as Rogue Necromechs or Acolytes. They only can get 4 stacks of any status proc in the game. By having these on, not only can we now get up to 16 procs, which is overkill, on normal enemies, easily fully armor stripping them, but we now go from 4 max corrosive stacks on Acolytes and Rogue Necromechs to 10, giving us significantly more armor strip on them. So while it's not necessary, it can be nice in some situations. The final two are also green Tau Forged, and these are both ability damage on enemies affected by corrosive status, which will obviously always be happening since we apply corrosive like crazy with our spores, and this is a multiplicative damage buff to everything else. So an extra 30% damage, very nice. Going on to the mods in the build. First, before I go over the strength stats, I should mention that the spore's base chance to apply corrosive per tick is 50%. So if you get up to 200% strength, every tick of the spore damage will apply corrosive. This isn't that important, honestly, because we have Sickening Pulse, which will max out the corrosive stacks anyways, on top of maxing out our viral when we cast Miasma. But if you care about that, that's a thing. We have a brief respite and catalyzing shields so that we don't die, because we need some form of survivability, and shield gating is just a very comfortable way to survive on Saryn, especially when we're spamming abilities like crazy. We have equilibrium for all of our energy needs. This is usually enough. I don't find myself needing anything else most of the time. Prime flow for max energy. Prime continuity for ability duration, transient fortitude for strength, umbral intensify for strength, then stretch and overextended for a ton of range so that we can have spores spreading very, very far. In the Axles, we have prime sure-footed so that we don't get knocked down. If you don't have this or don't want it, it is optional. You can run something else like normal sure-footed, handspring, or even cunning drift for an extra 15% range. It's not going to make that big of a difference, but it is still more range to make it so you can spread the spores farther. For the arcanes, we have Arcane Aegis, which is going to give us even more survivability. This is easily my favorite arcane in the game. It says 3% chance to proc, but I swear this activates all the time. And when it's active, you're pretty much invincible for the entirety of the duration. And that's really, really nice to have. Other than that, we have Molt's Vigor, so that when we cast an ability with our operator, the next ability from our Warframe gets a 45% strength bonus. Now you might be thinking, why not go with Molt's Augmented? This is going to be active all of the time once built up, and it is a 60% strength bonus. However, as I had said before, spore snapshots, so we can't really lose our spores if we really don't want to after having our Molt's Augmented build all the way up. Yes, it's going to benefit us more for Toxic Lash, but that's pretty much it. And we're building around spores here, not Toxic Lash. So Molt's Vigor is a much better option here, as it will actually work. Just remember to cast this and get the strength before you cast your spores at the beginning of the mission. That is it for Saryn's build on herself. For the weapons, we have Tenet Glaxion, because it is A, very, very strong in general, B, very, very fun, I love the Glaxion, and C, has lots of synergy with this. So, if you don't know how Toxic Lash works, let's briefly cover it, because it is a very complicated ability. Every single instance of damage you do has a second instance of damage done, right? Or at least instances of damages from your weapons. It will do a second instance of damage alongside the first one. Now that instance of damage is based off of the damage of your weapon, okay? So at base, it is a 30% extra damage. So if I do 100 damage with my weapon, the second hit that is from Toxic Lash is going to do 30 damage. This is going to benefit or double dip from faction multipliers like Roar or faction mods. On top of that, this second hit has a forced toxin proc, and that toxin proc triple dips faction multipliers. Doesn't really matter because we're not building into it, but it is still something to mention. And because Toxic Lash applies on any sort of instance of damage done, right, with the exception of most status procs not counting, it does count, however, and apply it on every single blast proc, okay? So it is going to double dip on blast. Also, the toxin damage, the toxin DOT from Toxic Lash, it benefits extra by putting toxin mods on specifically onto your weapon. So there are so many ways to double and triple and even quadruple dip with this ability, which is why we are going with Blast and Toxin on the Tenet Glaxion. Our base element is magnetic because it helps shred Overguard, and that's very nice. The build is pretty straightforward. Prime Shred for fire rate, punch through, because punch through is nice. It lets us chain more beams. This weapon can only chain 2 maximum beams, but Having 2 is more than 0 beams chaining. Also punch through in general, even if it didn't do that, would be nice. Photon overcharge, even though we're not applying cold, if our teammates are, this is just going to give us more energy, I guess, for ourselves and them. But if you don't have this, or you don't want it, just run vital sense. Critical delay for crit chance. Thermite rounds for heat and status. Rhyme rounds for cold and status to make blast. Malignant force for extra toxin and status, and it puts toxin on the weapon. Galvanized aptitude, which is additive on this weapon for status chance and base damage. Galvanized chamber for multi-shot. Sinister reach for range. And primary blight, because this way we don't need kills to build it up. It's very easy. And multi-shot and crit damage is very, very nice. And we're already applying toxin with our weapon. We don't need to worry about corrosive or viral on the enemy. Everything's going to be fully armor stripped at max viral procs anyways because of Saryn. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, if you don't have Prime Shred, just run normal Shred, or even a Riven, I guess you could run here instead. For the secondary weapon, we are using a Carius Prime, and this is mainly to shred Overguard, and it also gives us a bit of survivability. We have it built with Magnetic and Secondary Fortifier, because Magnetic does bonus damage to Overguard when the status proc exists on the enemy, and Secondary Overguard or Fortifier gives you 8 times damage to Overguard, which is multiplicative. Also, it siphons the Overguard from the enemy to give it to ourselves, which gives us lots of status immunity. Knockdown resistance is part of that, even though it won't have 100% uptime, but also Overguard gating, so this just helps us stay alive. And the reason we're using a Carius Prime specifically is it has very good ammo economy and very big explosions, very fast fire rate, good reload speed, so we can spread this everywhere to shred Overguard and give ourselves Overguard very, very fast and effectively. Hornet Strike for base damage, Frost Bites, and Prime Convulsions, so we can get Magnetic, Lethal Torrent for fire rate multi-shot, Creeping Bullseye for crit chance, Prime Target Cracker for crit damage, Prime Fulmination for a bigger AoE, Galvanized Diffusion for multi-shot, and Primed Pistol Ammo Mutation for extra ammo economy. You don't actually need this. I don't think I've even ever run out of ammo when I use the normal version of Pistol Ammo Mutation, but if you have the Prime version, might as well slap it on. For the melee weapon, we are using the Falcor, and this is going to be mainly for helping us spread spores and just statuses in general. Falcor is very, very nice because compared to other glaives, if you run Volatile Rebound, which causes explosions and disables punch through, it does not disable the infinite base punch through on Falcor, and Falcor can still bounce around as well, meaning we have explosions combined with the glaive bouncing around and hitting enemies. It also, unlike the glaive or Serrata, it has like heat seeking when you initially throw it. The Falcor, or not Falcor, the Serrata or the glaive Prime or the Zorus have seeking for enemies if A, there's no explosion mod on it, and B, you hit an enemy with it first, right? You have to throw it and hit, and then it enables the seeking. This is the moment you throw it, it's going to heat seek enemies. So it also has electric base on it, so that's pretty snazzy. Of course, we are going to go with melee influence then to spread statuses galore and do some fairly decent damage, and this combined with Toxic Lash is going to help us just throw it down hallways and spread spores everywhere. Very, very good for helping us spread spores. Whirlwind to make it fast as fuck. The stance doesn't really matter. Melee Elementalist status damage is nice, but we're mostly using it for the wind-up speed. Amalgam Organ Shatter also for the wind-up speed. You don't need the extra crit damage. It does give heavy diminishing returns when you run more than one mod with wind-up speed, but it's still enough of an increase with how fast it is that I can feel it. Although I guess really you'd probably better off switching to Killing Blow here since we don't have high crit chance. Shocking Touch for higher electric DOT, same with Voltaic Strike, and we get extra stats chance. Weeping Wounds for more status. Drifting Contact for even more status, and we get combo duration. Condition Overload for big PB damage because they will have a lot of status on all the enemies. We have Materai as our focus school, and this is because we can A, get power transfer for 50% casting speed, which is very nice when it's active, and B, sling strength because it gives us 40% ability strength, letting us snapshot another 40% onto our spores for even more damage. It's also just in general really good for killing stuff in like Void Cascade, or if you get downed and you have Last Gasp, it helps you kill stuff super easily to make yourself basically immortal. For our companion, we are running the Hound, and It is a fairly basic hound build, I'd say. This is just meant for spreading statuses, like with Repo Audit, Synergized, Prospective, Evasive Denial. I suggest putting them in this order specifically. You also really need Manifold Bond for this build to work. Momentous Bond will help get it back alive faster if it dies, as well as give us more statuses to spread everywhere. We have Guardian to help keep ourselves alive, which also can benefit from Manifold Bond, reducing the cooldown. Synth Deconstructs for lots of health orbs, which means lots of energy because we have Equilibrium equipped, and the rest is pretty straightforward, right? You know, shield stuff so it doesn't die in vacuum, because I hate having to grab stuff manually. Then for the melee weapon, we just slap on a bunch of statuses. I don't even need viral here, I guess, now that I think about it, because we are already spreading viral normally, and we do have the mod on our Galaxions so that we can get extra energy orbs when killing enemies affected by cold. You could theoretically remove the viral from here, right? Like we would duplicate this build over to configuration B and run cold on it instead, though you got to be careful because like we have electric here. If we leave that on, it's going to mix, and that would make magnetic, but we already have magnetic from one of our abilities on our hound, and so, you know, overkilling on magnetic would be pretty pointless. So we will remove that though, because we can, so why not? I'm not really sure what else I would run here now in its place. I don't think it really matters, so we'll just leave it be. And that is it for the build. It is quite effective, and more importantly, funny and nostalgic, I guess, because it really brings me back to the good old days where people ran Saryn for her spores rather than just Toxic Lash to make every weapon OP. It is very dependent on being in a mission for a long time, because that gives you more time to build up the spores. So like if I try to show it here right now, it's not really going to do much against these enemies because of that, right? We'll like cast that and then do this. I mean, it kills those guys. The guys that died up front were because they had the toxin procs from our Galaxion, but I guess the enemies around the back died still decently fast. But when you build up those spores to a high value in mission, it can do some big damage. And while I'm not going to be doing like a level cap, I will show this in a brief mission. So let's go into a moat survival. Here we are in the mission. Make sure you always snapshot cast your strength. I tend to forget because I'm very like absent-minded, but if you aren't dumb like me and you remember to do it, you'll get much higher damage. So make sure you do that. Go into your operator, get your sling strength, just dash into the ground for it, cast an ability so you'll get your molt vigor, and then make sure the first ability that you cast is your spores. I'm gonna need some energy, so let's do that. Cast this, try not to die because there's enemies everywhere. If there were Eximus, that would be great, except we're like at the beginning of a mission and Eximus don't spawn at the start of the mission. So try to be careful early on since you can't overguard gate, because you need to shield gate, but we don't have a lot of energy yet. So it's kind of annoying at the beginning of a mission, but it's not really that big of a deal, especially when you're in a team, because I mean, not everything's gonna be shooting at you then. It's just going to make life a lot easier. Once our spores start to really build up and enemies will die, look at it, 27 affected. With the big range, it's quite nice. The main thing that you want to do when you're playing this build is make sure the spores are constantly spreading. Like if you see it's only active on like 2 enemies and it's about to like not be on them anymore, you really got to make sure you cast your miasma close enough to where they're at so that those enemies will spread them normally. Otherwise they'll start decaying if it's not on any enemies, and you will quickly lose all of the built up spore damage that you had, meaning you aren't going to be able to kill stuff anymore, or at least not until you build it back up. This kind of setup overall though isn't hard to keep going. Just look where the damage numbers are and try to stay within the postal code when you cast your 4. Not much effort to it. And like what I had said when I was showing it initially in the simulacrum, is it's going to be stronger the longer you're in a mission. So like if you try to do a level cap run, you're like doing say Void Cascade, Kuva Survival, or Kuva Disruption, I guess is something some people do. I guess it's like more effective or something. I don't know. I haven't farmed Kuva in like 5 years. that being said, regardless, okay, it's very, very good for that kind of stuff because it gives you time to build up your spores. Because there is, to my knowledge, there should not be a cap to the spores in the game. And so you can just get it going higher and higher and higher. And I mean, I'm sure you can imagine how crazy it would be if your spores got up to say 100,000, because then you're doing 100,000 damage with your spores. And that's a hefty amount of damage when it's like each spore proc, plus we add viral in, a bunch of other stuff, starts getting pretty absurd the amount of damage you can do to enemies. And it's in a massive radius, which just makes things even more intense for your enemies, that is. I'm sure if you're doing that kind of thing, like a long-term mission, it will be nice for your teammates. They'll appreciate not having to ever worry about killing stuff, or they'll get annoyed, one of the two. If you bring this into like a Hydron where people are trying to level stuff, they'll probably tell you to off yourself or something. But I mean, that's just one of the perks of being a Saryn player in Warframe. I'm sure if you played Saryn for longer than 5 minutes, then you've probably already had someone tell you to take a bath with a toaster because you're playing a Saryn. I know I have. And boy howdy is it hilarious. I do have a slight complaint with this build, which would be the Hound specifically. That's the only real thing I have the issue with. Energy is not an issue as long as you run around and pick it up. I mean, you might have noticed I got down to half energy there because our abilities are decently expensive to cast. They're not like crazy expensive, but they're not cheap either. So you do want to make sure you're running around and picking up energy. But what I was going to say was my main issue with this build is actually the Hound. The Hound is really nice. It does its job well, okay? It's not like it fails at what it's supposed to do. Its problem is that it dies a lot. And even with Momentous Bond, it coming back alive is often not going to happen immediately, and it's just really annoying. Kind of pisses me off. Look, 6,000 spores built up, and we're actually doing some pretty good damage against that Acolyte. That's pretty damn respectable, especially when Acolyte level usually doesn't build, I don't think, in normal missions. Look, he's already dead. We didn't even need to attack him. He's just dead. Beautiful. That is some, you know, top-notch Saryn gameplay right there. Just running around spamming your abilities and everything dies. Our energy is getting a little bit low. If we were to kill stuff with our Glaxion, because we are getting cold procs occasionally spread because of our Hound, we'll be able to get more energy orbs. And when you're with a team, look, we're already back at max energy. Not hard at all. And when you're with a team, you know, they're killing stuff, they're making energy. Sometimes they have stuff that gives you energy outright. You very, very likely will not have energy issues pretty much ever, unless like you're going in between places and Void Cascade. I guess it might get a little bit annoying then, because you are going to have to be careful about keeping your spores active. But outside of like niche scenarios like that, you shouldn't really struggle. I don't think you probably want to like sit here for 5 years while I try to build up my spores. I mean, we're already killing everything just fine, right? Like I've gotten barely any gun kills. What are my my kills? 832 kills in 6 minutes. I think that's pretty damn good. I don't really sweat in this game, and I don't care about KPM. I know that's something some people do care about. So I mean, if you want to do the math on that, 800 divided by 6 minutes, so it would be 800 divided by 6. That's at least like what, 120 KPM, something like that. I'd say that's pretty solid. Look at that decaying. Now it's decaying. You can see how fast it decays. That's why you got to be careful. You don't want to lose all your spore damage, because it's really, really sad when that does happen. But yeah, pretty high KPM for something that's pretty low effort and very, very effective. This is just, I wanted to like redo the last one because there were a couple things that could have been improved, and the main thing is someone pointed out I was running a blind rage and blind rage with fleeting expertise, when it would be better to go Umbral Intensify and Transient Fortitude. I realized that. I was like, wait a second, I'm stupid. But then I had to reforma to fix it, so I did do that. I think I put an Umbral Forma on my Saryn, not necessary, but I did it anyways. Why not? So yeah, that's the Saryn Spores build, the revised version, I guess. If you liked the video, then maybe leave a like and subscribe. That's gonna do it. Also, there will be a link to the Discord should you like to join, and a link to my Ko-Fi, which is like Patreon but not sucky, if you would like to help support the channel. Adios.